This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So President Trump couldn't just leave the good news coming out of the G20 that there was going to be a temporary truce to the trade war between the United States and China. Couldn't just leave that alone. Couldn't just let Larry Kudlow do the talking. Larry Kudlow coming out of the G20 on Varney the other day saying this.
President Xi and Vice Premier Liu He has said to us their commitments will begin immediately, Stuart. Immediately. Okay. Now, I don't know that point has been made. That doesn't mean we're going to cover everything in the first 3 days. However, when it comes to the agriculture, energy, industrial purchases, and so forth, these are private sector purchases where tariff rates will be lowered. And also non-tariff barriers will be lowered with respect to American ownership, for example, with respect to technology transfers, with respect to IP. Those things should kick in soon. We should see palpable changes on the Chinese side immediately.
We need palpable changes on the president's rhetoric on this side immediately. I'm not nearly as optimistic as Kudlow is about what China will do tangibly other than potentially lower some tariffs. But in terms of the non-tariff barriers, I don't buy that at all. However, Trump yesterday sparking a sell-off.
Yeah, because of a tweet. President Xi and I want this deal to happen, and it probably will. But if not, remember, I am a tariff man. And
when people or countries come in to raid the great wealth of our nation, I want them to pay for the privilege of doing so. Trade is raiding the great wealth of our nation. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of trade policy, which we knew. I mean, I'm not feigning surprise. He has been saying the same thing for 3 decades, so nobody should be surprised. But don't tell me he's saying something different than what he's saying. And this has been the conversation for the last 2 years with Steve Moore and other free market economists, or otherwise free market economists, with respect to Trump on trade. He has it wrong. He doesn't understand. And this tweet, we are right now taking in billions of dollars in tariffs. Make America rich again. So we're going to tax our way to prosperity. That is a fair translation of what that statement means. Yeah. Make America rich again, taking billions in tariffs. I am a tariff man. That's the president saying, I am a tax man. What kind of market positioning is that? For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by John Tamny, who is the director of the Center for Economic Freedom, editor of RealClearMarkets.com, and the author of the book, The End of Work, Why Your Passion Can Become Your Job. Oh, I want to talk about that book, too. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. And I want to stress I couldn't agree more with the two of you in the way you've described this. We are talking, it's shameful what Republicans have done in the past couple of years. To suddenly run away from all that made them great in terms of free trade and allowing people, individuals, to trade the fruits of their labor with whomever they wanted. Suddenly they're all protectionists defending a president who says, I want to raise more revenues for the federal government on the backs of American producers, and in doing so, empower the federal government to grow. The government doesn't take in dollars to look at them. That just gives it more control over our lives, more control over the economy, and Republicans have gone along with it. I find it very embarrassing. I've always voted Republican. I don't see how I could do it at this point.
Do you see this as an overture from President Trump to not only congressional Democrats but back to his Rust Belt base in states that he needs in 2020? This is at least in part a political play, even though, again, to repeat, he's been saying things like this for 3 decades. So nobody should feel the need to have the scales fall from their eyes on this.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. There are some politics at play here, for sure. And the beauty of it, you guys, of course, alluded to it. There was a major stock sell-off, and it's a reminder that the most powerful force in the world, much more powerful than nuclear weapons or anything like that, is the stock market. Trump can only take this so far, at which point he destroys what he's made his presidency about. And one area in which I've cheered him on is he's been the one president to say, I want to be judged by the stock market. Wouldn't it be great if all presidents let market signals be the judge of their achievements? Because the least interventionist president would, in most instances, have the boomingest stock market. Okay, well, so if you liked it going up, you must acknowledge that your desire to limit the ability of Americans to exchange has had a very negative impact on the stock market, and for obvious reasons. Trump is going after the biggest market in the world for our best companies. Apple is the most valuable company in the world. It sells 20% of its iPhones in China. McDonald's, that's China's second largest market, soon to be its first. Nike, that's its second largest market. There are 3,400 Starbucks in China. There are soon to be 7,000. There are double the number of Starbucks in Shanghai than there are in New York City. GM sells a third more cars in China every year than it does in all of North America. The list goes on and on. Boeing sells a quarter of its planes in China. To go to war with China on trade is the equivalent of Gucci telling Manhattan and Beverly Hills, oh, we don't want to sell to you anymore. And so is it any wonder that stocks sell off when you are looking to limit the ability of U.S. companies to transact with what remains a small market even now, but will be the biggest market in the world in the future. It's already huge, but when the Chinese get rich, it's going to be a massive market for U.S. companies, and we're trying to ruin that trade relationship.
Well, do you think President Trump's tweet, though, I mean, that there was a direct correlation between that and then the Dow plunging 799 points?
Well, I think there is a combination. I think isn't it interesting that every time the media come out and cheer Trump for basically blinking, for walking back the rhetoric as in, okay, there's a 90-day delay and the markets like it. And so if you notice the op-eds on Monday, and they were Trump blinked, Trump stepped back, he did the right thing. He hates to be seen as weak. And so what does he respond with? Well, the tweet, but also for what was front page news yesterday, Robert Lighthizer, a longtime protectionist, going back decades, much like Trump, will now lead the talks with China. That's a fairly strong signal that this idea that we're going to wait 90 days and then come to kind of an innocuous deal that both sides can say they had a victory with is, oh, no. We're looking to extract huge concessions that would, in fact, hurt American consumers, hurt American businesses, and hurt American productivity.
It's remarkable. Something you said at the outset in terms of how Republicans have sort of lost their way when it comes to being free traders, and also lost their way when it comes to reflecting on the not-so-distant past, particularly as we memorialize Bush 41 and think about the 80s. George Will's famous pronouncement when the wall came down, the Cold War is over and the University of Chicago won it. And the idea that the market and the market forces exposing the internal contradictions of the Soviet Union in the same way that market forces will expose the internal contradictions of the Chinese communists. I don't know why we don't learn the economics lesson from the Cold War and apply it to the Chinese.
Oh, I think you put it so well. This is exactly what I'm saying, and that's probably why I think you put it so well. Here, conservatives in the 20th century remember how they were the leading proponents of economic liberalization and freedom for these imprisoned people in China and the Soviet Union that had been murdered by a failed ideology. And so now they achieve this freedom. Now the Chinese, still a very poor country, but increasingly very prosperous because they've adapted our market-focused ways. When conservatives say they're still communists, that's laughable. Visit China and you will see. They have embraced our ways amazingly, beautifully. And so they've done this. And so more of the world is free. And what do you see conservatives saying now? Look at Peter Berkowitz from Hoover Institution, this great Cold War institution. He was saying that all this freedom, all these imports from around the world, all this automation, which has defined U.S. prosperity, is causing men to have children out of wedlock, to be lazy, to develop opioid addictions. You have Orrin Cass from the Manhattan Institute saying, well, China doesn't play fairly. They subsidize their industries to our detriment. Well, wait a second. American conservatives have always said subsidized industries are the weakest because they are not exposed to the market signals that make them great. Orrin Cass also says the American worker is exposed to too much globalization, so we should give them, care of the federal government, subsidies. Amazing there is that conservatives cheer because Americans are now forgotten by this growth of freedom around the world. Are we kidding? Conservatives were all about this, and with good reason. This hasn't hurt the American worker. You can never be hurt by the division of labor that's globalized. You can never be hurt by the rest of the world fighting feverishly to compete to serve you. Yet conservatives have turned tail. They're so confused by Trump's election that they no longer even believe what used to animate what was once a highly intellectual movement that's become ridiculous and protectionist.
What do you think President Trump could do or tweet to help the situation when the markets reopen on Friday?
Well, he could say, I didn't mean it, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
can he walk
the
tweet back?
What I think he can do, and look, my frustration, I've had a debate with Steve Moore live where he bashed China, and of course I defended its rise as something that's been great for the U.S. economy, which of course it has. And Steve, and I pointed out, Steve, you never said this stuff until Trump was elected. What changed? And so the point is, there are people inside the administration who get it, who get that free trade never could injure the American worker, and globalization could never injure any worker, that there are no losers in this. And so what you have to hope is that the wise minds inside the administration, in different subtle ways, try to walk this back and say, we are not going to let this happen. And I think the way you convince Trump is you say, look, one-term presidents aren't viewed as successes in history. If you want to be a two-term president, you better be focused on the economy. Tariffs harm the economy every time, and they certainly harm the stock market. So if you want to carry a weaker stock market into the 2020 election such that you lose, continue doing what you're doing. If not, go play golf for the last 2 years and win in 2020.
Right. And I mean, look, President Trump has made pronouncements that are Kudlowian in nature previously about the desire to get to a lower tariff environment across the board. This is a pathway to that. I don't know that I really believe that he believes that, but at least he's saying it. So he's said contradictory things on the topic, and maybe he'll do contradictory things on the topic, and so that's part of it. And Kudlow's influence is important, but I think the market, sure. I mean, he was obsessed with that for the first year. He's very quiet on it of late. And yesterday, the I word was mentioned: inverted yield curve, which has been the best predictor of recession for the last 60 years. So the narrowing of that yield curve, I assume, is something that's being communicated to him, or should be.
Yeah, usually it is. My sense is if you look closer at it, the yield curve basically predicts something well down the line. For one thing, I would say recessions are healthy. Recessions just are a sign of an economy cleansing itself of bad habits.
But right down the line. But if down the line is a conversation about recession in 2020, that's not good.
Yeah. No, that's true. And so, look, anytime you limit the ability of people to receive from the rest of the world, you bring on an economic slowdown, because if the rest of the world has more difficulty selling to us, we can't sell our goods as readily. And this matters when you consider what a huge market China is. But let's also add that the greatest thing about free trade for economic growth is that it makes it much more likely that we'll get to do the work that most elevates our skills. When you can divide up your work with more of the world, you can focus on what you do best. And we all know, all three of us get to do something we love every single day. That's why we're productive. And so free trade, tariffs make it less likely that we get to do what we're good at, and so it saps our productivity. It's no mistake the 1930s were a slow decade. you put record tariffs on foreign goods, you force Americans into work that they're not as good at doing. And so this would be one of the effects of tariffs today. And so markets naturally price that. Trump's got to be made aware of that. But even if he doesn't want to believe it, he's got to want to believe that moving in this direction is going to force him to campaign on a lousy stock market, all the while the opposition running ads showing how much he was wrapping himself in the stock market when he's doing well.
John Tamny, director for the Center for Economic Freedom, as editor of RealClearMarkets.com, and author of the book The End of Work, Why Your Passion Can Become Your Job. I'll have to explore how I can make my love of the xylophone my job at another time. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro.